School, James Armbruster. She was the assistant principal at Elon Park Elementary School from 2014 to 2019. She's been the assistant principal at Huntington Farms Elementary School. She was the assistant principal at Elon Park Elementary School from 2014. She's also served as a literacy facilitator at Walter J. Byers. She's been a teacher at McAlpine Elementary, a teacher at Berwick Elementary, a teacher at Parkwood Montessori, and a teacher at J. Byers, a teacher at McAlpine Elementary. She also has spent a little time in elementary, state in the south of us, Montessori, South Carolina, and she has her bachelor's degree in elementary education from the state of the south and a master's degree in South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Jane. And she has her bachelor's degree in elementary education from the state of the south and a master's degree. Please join me. Do you have anybody you'd like to introduce to the group? And she has her bachelor's degree in elementary education from the state of the south and a master's degree. Do you have anybody you'd like to introduce to the group? And she has her bachelor's degree in elementary education. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Gust. She is the principal at River Oaks Academy. She's been an assistant principal at Blythe Elementary School, assistant principal at Berwick Elementary, a math facilitator at Stanley Mountain Island Lake. She's been an assistant principal at Blythe Elementary School. She's also taught at Hawk Creek Elementary, a math facilitator at Stanley. She has her bachelor's degree from State University of New York, Macedonia. She's a master's degree at Hawk Creek Elementary, a math facilitator at Stanley as well. She has her bachelor's degree from State University of New York, Macedonia. Do you have anybody you'd like to introduce today as well? She has her bachelor's degree from State University of New York. Thank you. Do you have anybody you'd like to introduce today as well? She has her bachelor's degree from Thank you. Do you have anybody you'd like to introduce today?
Okay, I was asked to give last greetings to Gita. This is her last time with us in this board meeting also. Last greetings to Gita. Congratulations. This is her last time with us in this board meeting also. And Steve, I do want to recognize you. You have surpassed me as the hardest working zone superintendent there is in CMS, okay? You have surpassed. Congratulations. You got your award. Zone superintendent there is in CMS, okay? Congratulations. We now move to our action items. We have 3 action items for consideration tonight. For the last 2 items which come to the board, we now move to our action items. I'll return to Dr. Jones, the chair of the policy committee, to introduce the items and present motions on behalf of the policy committee. I'll return to Dr. Jones, the chair of the policy committee. We're going to do A, which is recommend present motions on the 2019-2020 continuous learning calendar. And Sergeant entertaining that motion, which is recommend present motion comment 2019-2020 continuous learning calendar. And Sergeant entertaining that motion, which is recommend present motion comment 2019-2020 continuous learning calendar. And Sergeant entertaining that motion, which is recommend present motion comment 2019-2020.
I am here to present an impact report on the continuous learning calendar. On this particular slide, you'll see an outline of the topics that are covered in this report. I will not present tonight all of these items, but within the report there is an appendix that includes slides that outline data points that may be of interest as you consider this decision. So the first thing I thought I would do is just walk us through a little bit of the background on the continuous learning calendar schools so that we know how we have arrived at this place. Back in 2013-14, 4 Project Lift schools began operating under what we have called a continuous learning calendar. I think the name in and of itself demonstrates what the purpose of those calendars were when we first started. I think the name in and of itself, and that was to mitigate summer learning loss. As we know, all children have some summer learning loss, and some students more than others. To mitigate summer learning loss, that we know in communities where they have some summer learning loss and some have fewer, thus increasing the effects of summer learning loss. Communities where the other purpose of the calendar was to enhance the overall thus increasing the effects of time for those students. The other purpose of the calendar. It is important to note that prior to this journey beginning, CMS and the Project Lift Governance Board successfully lobbied the state legislature have a waiver that allowed two of the schools to operate with an additional 19 days. We are the only public schools regular to operate in the state that have that flexibility. It's also important to note here that in 2018, all four schools went back to the 180-day calendar. Important to note here that we no longer leveraging that 19 additional days. I thought it would be important for us to understand both the benefits and the potential disadvantages of a continuous learning calendar. For a year-round calendar, and you can see a list of those potential educational outcomes, minimizing summer learning for a year-round calendar, opportunities for management and remediation during intersession, and some studies have shown a reduction in discipline problems, opportunity burnout, more motivation for teachers and students because of the breaks spread out throughout the reduction in discipline, and more availability of burnout, more motivation for teachers and students. Given that, I think it's important to also share with you the more availability of burnout. Some studies highlight that it can increase it. Given that, I think it's important to also share with you pretty much around the school year because some studies highlight that it can increase it. Given that, it's important to family vacation pretty much around the school daycare, some studies highlight siblings that have differing calendars, difficulties scheduling in-service days, and there could be an increased cost of operation. Want to now go into the impact report of what we have seen over time with the outcomes as it relates to the continuous learning calendar implementation. I should add here that the research done on this particular aspect of the Project Lift strategy was Research for Action. They are a third-party evaluator out of Philadelphia, and we basically leaned on them to be an unbiased third party to look at student outcomes, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So all of the research that you're going to see in the subsequent slides are come from their research. One of the things that Research for Action made sure to highlight in their report is that there are several limitations to the report and the research they were able to do on impact. And they made a caution that a decision about whether to move forward or to stop the continuous learning calendar should not be solely based on student outcomes for the following reasons. When the initiative began, the 4 CLC schools performed lower already than the other schools in Project Lift. So what the study basically says is that there's not a strong comparison. You cannot find a comparison school to these schools because they were already performing significantly below the other schools. And another limitation of the study is that there were so many other factors that were happening. It's difficult to extrapolate the impact of the CLC calendars against other potential impacts, such as the fact that all the CLC schools are pre-K-8 schools, and there were a variety of other initiatives happening simultaneously at the same time. So it's very difficult for the research to say one thing did not. I guess I should summarize to say that it's what you're getting ready to see is correlational, not causation. Some additional things that are important to note is just the small sample size, only 2 schools operating under the CLC model. Again, impossible to disentangle the CLC effects from other school effects. The list of those limitations are there for you to consider. So moving on to the impact. You see a chart that entails a lot of data, but let me try to pull out the highlights of that data. So this analysis of the CLC impact is specifically focused on grades 3 through 5. On the left side of the chart, you can see a comparison of scale scores. So when students take an end of grade test, there is a raw score that comes out. And then there's also proficiency or college and career readiness. So on the right side of the slide, you see a comparison of proficiency. The slide shows this data for years 2013-14 through 2015-16, and it essentially compares the CLC schools to as close as they could possibly get to a comparison group. So where you see positive numbers or numbers that obviously are not negative, you can see that CLC schools outperformed the comparison group. Where you see negative numbers, that is where CLC schools did not outperform, the comparison group outperformed. Where you see stars, that's a very important highlight. The stars signify the statistical significance of the underperformance or the overperformance. So where you see stars, you see that there is a statistically significant difference actually in the performance. It means it really mattered, basically. Similarly, on the 6th through, well, I guess before I go there, let me just highlight. So what this slide basically pulls out is that the CLC calendar students' gains in reading were not statistically significantly different from those of their matched comparison non-LIFT schools. And on the math 3rd through 5th grade, students at CLC scores made significantly smaller gains in both scale scores and proficiency rates compared to their non-LIFT peers in both years 2014 and 15. In grades 6 and 8, you see similar data points in the slide, the same comparisons, CLC calendar to the comparison group, looking at both scale score and proficiency. Again, you see pluses, you see places where there is underperformance, and you also see stars. The stars, again, signal statistical significance. The highlight of this slide is that the CLC students improved about the same or slightly more than their comparison students in reading in grades 6 through 8, and in math, they performed significantly less in year 4. As you consider the impact of the CLC calendar, I thought it was important for you to consider the budgetary implications. So what you're going to see on the next slide is essentially what philanthropic dollars have gone to support the CLC calendars over the last 5 years. And so essentially about $80,000 each year goes to transportation costs. It costs to transport students to and from school from July, which is their start date, to the first day of school for CMS. We also offer to students intercession camps, about $62,000 per school, for teachers to work during the intercessions to provide academic support and enrichment for students. These intercessions are strongly attended by students in K-4, not so much attended by older students in those schools. And then the biggest cost of operating these schools go to compensation, simply because assistant principals, social workers, counselors, psychologists, and other staff traditionally only work 10 months of the school year, but in order to get school up and running, in order to have everything ready for the opening of schools, support families in the transition, increase attendance, we are paying for an additional month and sometimes 2 months of employment for some of these groups. So the total budgetary impact is about $830,000. You see that this supports about 1,700 students. The cost per student is about $480 per student. There was also a survey done in the first week of January to get stakeholder input on the CLC calendars. I want to give you the outcomes of that report or that survey. This is an aggregate of all 4 schools. In the appendix, you can see a breakdown per school. But as you can see from this particular survey, about 42, what we offered to our stakeholders was 2 versions of a CLC calendar, similar to what CMS does with the traditional calendar. Same calendar, moving work days around, start of school around. We offered 2 different options, and then we also offered the option of reverting back to a traditional calendar. As you can see, about 42% of the participants on the survey opted for the CLC option 1. About 38 opted for the second version, and 19% demonstrated that they would prefer a traditional calendar. And I will stop my report at that point. Again, wanting to point out that in the appendix there are several additional slides that could possibly answer some questions, but I would now like to open myself up for questions and/or discussion.
Okay, you want the board to,
If you have questions.
okay, if you have questions, okay, Ms. Byers Bailey.
Thank you for this report and for the appendix, which was very helpful. What I'm curious about is the anecdotal information that you got. You've given us the statistical evaluation of whether the CLC was effective or not. Was there any anecdotal information from staff or parents that was collected regarding whether they felt CLC was effective?
For teachers and principals, I think what they would tell you, and I will do my best to give you pros and cons for each, because I think there are pros and cons for each. I think teachers and principals would share with you that there have been less summer incidents involving a lot of students because they have a shorter summer to possibly get in trouble, be in the neighborhood with unstructured opportunities. Students come back to school more ready to learn. They spend less time reviewing rules, procedures, and content because the summer is shorter, and students demonstrate a readiness to return to school much faster than when there's a 12 or 13-week summer gap. I think teachers would also share with you that those intersession breaks come right on time for them, as burnout is happening across the district with other employees that have worked. They have those intersessions nicely placed so that they can take those breaks and come back rejuvenated. And I think they would say the same for students as well. We've seen a decrease in behavioral incidents to evidence that point. I think we have a couple of schools that the principals would say, as they were starting their magnet programs, the CLC calendars came into question so many times as they were trying to provide professional development to get staff ready for the new magnet programs. I also think some principals and staff would say it's very difficult sometimes to garner support from the district as a whole, because when we're gearing up for school, other people are on break. And so sometimes it's hard to contact people and get questions answered as efficiently as it would be if we had a traditional start time. As far as parents are concerned, most of our parents have been very much on board with the CLC calendar. They've acclimated well to it, and I've received very few complaints. I do think in one particular school there are more parents that have voiced concern about the calendar than in the other three.
Regarding the intercessions, with the whole idea of CLC was to combat summer learning loss. Part of the CLC compacts intersperses the intercessions so that those periods are shorter. And I think you said the anecdotal response of the staff was that the students didn't have as much loss and they came back ready to learn. And you also said that most of the kids didn't go to the intercessions except for the younger ones.
I would say I wouldn't say most. I don't have a number to give you, but I would say we see larger attendance from our K-4 students than we do our 5-8 students.
Lyft paid for the services during the intercession. If we had the same calendar but didn't run intercession, would there still be the staff costs that you indicated?
Potentially for over the summer, because again, there are only 6 weeks or so between end of school and start of school, whereas the rest of CMS has 12 or 13 weeks to prepare for opening of school, there's a limited amount of time, so all hands on deck to turn the school over for a new school year. I think the cost of intercessions could be eliminated, but not necessarily the cost to pay for summer support.
Okay.
It's not necessary to provide enrichment opportunities. I think it would be a great time for community partners to step up to do that, but it also costs money for those organizations to run and operate. So I think that's something that has to be considered.
Okay. That's all for now.
Okay, Ms. Sawyer?
Thank you for the attendance data. I'd heard about the challenge of attendance during the summer session. So with 82% attendance, that's significantly lower than we have during the rest of the year, and I think that speaks to a real problem with the system with the calendar. If students aren't coming, even if their parents say they like the calendar, if 20% of the kids don't show up, that's not serving children. As I understand it, the recommendation is to keep the calendar in place for one more year with a hard stop after that. What is the downside of stopping the calendar immediately? Do we have staffing implications? Why have we decided to go for another year?
So I do think, in all fairness to teachers, they anticipate coming back in July. They get paid at the end of July. And so they plan their summers, they plan their budgets around a beginning start date and a pay date of July. And so for those particular staff members, it may create, it's February, so there's a little time to make an adjustment. I think the quicker we can get information out, the faster they can adjust to any changes that it may have. A year, waiting and giving it an additional year gives us time to plan to off-board or to allow it to sunset so that all stakeholders have time to adjust.
Mr. Strain?
Thanks for the information, Dr. Watts. I want to make sure I understand what's been presented, because there's a recommendation to continue it for a year and then stop. Mm-hmm. The alternative would either be to continue it until some point in the future, in perpetuity, or until another decision is made, or stop now.
Yes.
And I'm trying to find the basis by which we would continue this, because the cost listed here is $830,000 a year of continuing this program. But I struggled in the presentation to find any sort of strong case for continuing it, because if I look through even the perceived benefits, right, the reasons that were presented in order to start the continuous learning calendar, I see very few of these things that we've actually been able to demonstrably achieve, right, that we've been able to do that. And so either in terms of improved growth leading to improved proficiency levels, et cetera. And so you just said, if we stop it now, it might be some difficult decisions, and perhaps we should have had this conversation a few months ago. But I don't see that as a reason to continue it for a year if we're saying we should sunset it anyway. So can you help me understand why the recommendation would be to continue it for a year, short of, we've got some teachers that rightly so have planned for some pay during the summer, but I don't see the benefits to children of continuing it for a year.
So when you say benefits to children, I think we need to calibrate on what that definition is. If you're talking about academic benefits to children, I certainly agree. If we're talking about holistic benefits to children, students' well-being, students having opportunities to be in a structured environment over the summer, students having enrichment opportunities beyond the regular school, what school offers. Sure. To me, there are benefits that are being realized that don't necessarily show up in an academic data point. I agree that the data does not necessarily suggest an academic benefit, but I can't necessarily say that our students aren't benefiting from it.
Fair enough. Are there other programs offered by the county or otherwise that could help bridge this gap then? That would provide the sort of benefits that you're talking about in terms of the whole child? Because clearly we're not seeing the academic benefits in terms of the data points that were pulled and prepared that we had analyzed. And so are there other programs there that would help bridge that gap for short of continuing the continuous learning calendar that presumably we would be looking at instituting in a year's time anyway?
Absolutely. So, of course, CMS offers summer school and can certainly reach some students. Within your report, there is an appendix highlight around bail, which is another strategy we use to mitigate for summer learning loss. As you can see, the cost for bail is about $1,400 per student, which is considerably more than it would cost to run a CLC calendar. I think with all summer programs that you're going to see, including bail, your student attendance will always be an issue because summer programs are optional. And so parents don't have to send their kids to summer programs. I think we probably, while attendance is not what we desire at the CLC calendars, the attendance is probably a little bit more than what you would find in a traditional program where it truly is optional. At least coming to school, there is an attendance requirement. So that in and of itself increases the likelihood that students will participate. But even with bail, if you look within that appendix, attendance was around 77 to 80%, so even lower than the attendance rates of the CLC calendar. So there are certainly other options to answer your question, but I think you run into many of the same obstacles.
Thank you.
Ms. Sawyer?
If a student doesn't show up in July and they come at the traditional start time for CMS, how many days of instruction will they have? I mean, we have 180 days. How many will those students get?
You could subtract about 20 days, so I'd say 160. One of the things that we started doing a couple of years ago was for those students who did arrive late, we started making the intercessions a little bit more mandatory for those students so that they could make up some of that time. But to answer your question, they're losing 20 days of instruction if they don't take advantage of the intercessions.
Ms. Marshall?
Just to clarify that attendance question on slide, the attendance rate with the graph. So July, that's really indicating the July start date. August is the start. Are we talking about all of August or just when the traditional calendar starts?
All of August.
All of August.
And then
Okay.
September, with just about every school in the district right after Labor Day, you'll see another increase in student attendance because you have parents coming from the north that traditionally don't start school until later in the fall.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Ms. Dashiell?
Processing this, this is not an easy one, and I've spoken with educators who are for and against continuing the CLC, and it sounds like one of the challenges has been that our system, we're really set up to support the August start date, and so like you mentioned, we have certain employees that aren't even at work in July who are needed to support schools, and so then the CLC schools kind of fall through the cracks. You have families that are programmed to have their kids show up, and I heard one person say they almost have 3 start dates. They have a bunch of kids that start in July, and then they have another first day of school in August and another first day of school in September. So cultural, sort of like a churn of establishing school culture. And then the challenge of siblings and also matriculating to middle schools and high schools, or high school really, that are on the same schedule. So I wish, when we started the CLC years ago, I wasn't on the board then, but I was watching it and wishing that my kids could go to a continuous learning
son does
calendar
go.
school. Yeah, because it makes so much sense to me. I wish our whole system worked this way. And then we'd all be in sync with each other. I wish the whole state worked this way. But it seems like we haven't, I mean, even when we've had the hurricane, the hurricane makeup days and the snow makeup days, and then we send the announcements out and the phone calls saying, such and such is a teacher work day, or such and such, you do have school on such and such a day. And then the parents at some of the CLC schools apparently were getting those messages saying, do we have school or do we not have school? So that might be why we haven't seen the academic gains, is because of all of that mix. But I do wish, I see the promise of it. I see why we gave it a shot. I wish we could make it work.
Oh, I thought you had a question in there somewhere.
Processing.
Mr. Superintendent, you have any follow-up comments?
I do not. It's a really difficult conversation. You have the results that we saw, we have the promise of it, but I don't have anything to add to this conversation, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Watts. Dr. Watts, I'm sorry. All right, we need so your recommendation is?
Our recommendation is that we continue it for one more year, that we take the approximately $800,000 that it will take to operate this from our fund balance, and that we clearly send a message to the larger community that we will not be undertaking this continuous learning calendar in the out years. That's largely due to some of the things that Dr. Watts previously said, but we really do think that we have, based on the survey results, a significant number of folks who really would have to change their plans in a way that was just not palatable to us. That includes not just community members, but parents and our own employee base.
Okay. Mr. Strain?
I'd like to make an alternate motion that we end the CLC effective this year.
Okay. All right.
Madam Chair,
Yes. I
was
haven't
there a
called.
motion?
No, not a motion yet. All right. Let us get a regular motion on the floor first, and then,
Oh, okay.
okay,
Yep.
we'll go from there. All right. Is there a motion to uphold the recommendation for that the superintendent is making?
So moved.
Is there a motion? You're making the motion? Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right. The motion is to uphold the superintendent's recommendation, okay? And Mr. Strain has a second motion,
Alternate motion
an alternate motion to
to
end.
end the
All right.
CLC effective this year.
Okay, so we will vote on the alternate first, and then, Ruby was his second. We'll vote on the alternate, and then we'll go to the main. Am I correct?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. All in favor of Mr. Strain's motion to end the CLC calendar for this year, let it be shown by a raising of hands. 2, 3, okay. Against, by a show of hands. I am abstaining, so I guess mine would be a motion for, to uphold the recommendation. So we are at 4-3. So the vote is to keep the superintendent's recommendation for one more year. Well, it's 4-3.
For the alternate.
For the alternate.
Oh, it's 4 for the alternate to end, I'm sorry. With an abstention, and I did that because I wanted to see how everybody was feeling, and nobody had called me to say, how do you feel about this, Mary? So that's why I wanted to abstain from it and see how the vote was going to fall. I know you're looking puzzled.
So we
So,
got a 3-3
with
on
a
the
vote
first-
of, when I abstain from the voting, that means I am upholding the
motion on the
the
table,
motion on the table,
which passes then at 4-3.
which passes on a 4-3. That's what it does.
So Sean, so
I'm lost.
So the alternate motion passes on a 4-3 with an abstention of the chair.
Right,
Okay, so your motion passed.
Correct.
yes.
Okay.
That is correct, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay, so we are ending it. The CLC will end.
Okay.
So, thank you all, and we will move on. Next, we go to B and C, which is consideration of changes to bylaw BBAA, individual board member authority, and C, consideration of changes to policy JL, student wellness. Okay, Dr. Jones, I turn to you as chair of the policy committee.
All right. Policy Code BBAA, Board Member Authority and Board Handbook. This is the final vote. Members of the board, the item before us tonight is the consideration of changes to bylaw BBAA, Board Member Authority and Board Handbook. These recommended changes to the bylaw are in response to the board's discussion at our retreat held in February of 2018. This new language creates a new board handbook that will allow for a better understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the board as a group and as individuals. This change was considered by the CMS Policy Committee on April 12, 2018, and was recommended for approval on a 3-1 vote. Therefore, Madam Chair, on behalf of the Policy Committee, I move for the approval of the recommended changes to bylaw BBAA as presented.
Okay, I would like to remind members of the board that in order for this bylaw to pass, we will need 2/3 vote of the board membership, not 2/3 of members present, but 2/3 vote of the board membership. And Dr. Jones, no second was needed for that motion. Is there any discussion before we move to a vote on BBAA? All right, all in favor of the motion, let it be known by saying aye. Aye. Oppose? Okay, that is a 7-0 vote, so we passed it by 2/3 of the board membership. All right, consideration of changes to policy JL, student wellness.
This is the final vote. Members of the board, the item before us tonight is the consideration of changes for policy JL, student wellness. This policy revision is in response to the board's desire to include evidence-based social and emotional instruction to the current policy that had previously only focused on physical and nutritional health. This policy change adds language mandating the inclusion of instruction and intervention for the social and emotional well-being of our students. This change was considered by the CMS Policy Committee on April 12, 2018, and was recommended for approval by a 3-1 vote. Therefore, Madam Chair, on behalf of the Policy Committee, I move for the approval of the recommended changes to policy JL as presented.
Okay, since this is also coming from the policy committee, no second is needed. All in favor of the motion, let it be known by saying aye.
May we speak to it?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, can we speak to it?
Yes, you can, I'm sorry.
So, so this vote was 3-1 in policy committee, and I voted against it. I voted against it because we often talk in this body about unfunded mandates. And whilst I certainly support the changes in terms of implementing additional support for our children, there was no consideration or any work done to determine what the cost of those changes would be. So we significantly changed this policy to provide greater support for our children, but we haven't considered the cost implications of doing so. And that's the reason I voted against it.
Okay,
This would be, in my opinion, the definition of an unfunded mandate when we go to the superintendent and say, we want to provide all these additional supports. And we haven't even considered what the cost of doing so would be.
all right. Any other board members? Mr. Superintendent, do you see it as an unfunded mandate?
I think there's significant costs associated with it.
Okay.
You're providing additional levels of service. So we've begun to look at those things, but we had not gotten it completed.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. All in favor of the motion, let it be known by saying aye. Aye. Oppose?
Opposed?
Okay, that is a 6-1. Thank you. All right. We now move to reports and information items. We have one report tonight, and that report is on the 2019-2020 operating budget update. Turn to the superintendent for this report.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to come down and lead this presentation, but what we want to do is begin to engage the board in a conversation around the board's priorities for funding. And so what you'll see tonight is, the first salvo of soliciting that information. I think Sheila will point out we have a number of community engagements that are coming up, but we'll also have a number of opportunities to talk with you both individually and collectively as a board before we actually roll out the superintendent's recommendation, which you'll consider and then make your own budget, okay? So with that, I'm going to turn to Sheila. Ms. Shirley, would you go ahead and walk the board through your presentation?
Okay. Good evening. And as I was sitting there looking at the date on this report, I realized that 1 month from tonight, we'll be bringing the budget to you as a superintendent's recommendation. So we're not far away. It's been a long journey. So the first couple of points are really just around the trends and some context for the conversation that we want to have. You all have seen this 100 times, but I just wanted you to have it at your disposal while we had the conversation tonight. The sources of our funds, we obviously know that the majority of our funds, about 59%, come from state funds, with 31% in this year coming from county and the rest coming from federal and other. The highlight on the uses side, we always want to point out and remind folks that this year 83% of our overall budget is applied towards salary and benefits for our staff. Looking at that a little deeper, this is something that we've shared just most recently with the County Commission and wanted to make sure that we spoke about it for a moment with you all. The salary and benefits by type of or grouping of staff is shown here. What I'd like to point out is 72% of them are certified staff. That includes our teachers, counselors, social workers, psychologists, media specialists, anybody that's paid on the certified teacher salary schedule. So that's the blue, obviously the predominant component of our salary breakdown. This again is the 83% of our budget. The next piece, as you can see, the school-based support and school administration, if you add those together and include the custodial staff, and the reason I say that is that when I say school-based staff, I say, do they work and live and eat and breathe at the school every day? So that's what I define as school-based staff. And when you look at that, 83% of our budget going to allocated to salaries and benefits, 88% of that amount is for school-based staffing. Shifting gears just a moment so that I can just give you a little context before we start the conversation about some of our budget considerations. So I typically do this in January, but they didn't quite get it to us, or they didn't quite release it early enough this year. But the Fiscal Research Division always does an update on the general revenue, or the general fund revenue for the state, typically in that January timeframe. And in this year, there's also been the Fiscal Research Division and the Office of State Budget and Management do a consensus revenue projection. So I'm going to talk about both of those. In the general fund revenue update, the highlights were that during the first half of 18-19, the general fund revenue was $188.6 million, above the $11.1 billion revenue target. So That's very positive, but the state is still on track. They said, however, the state's still on track to reach the fiscal year's $23.1 billion revenue target, so that's really good news. The economy's on solid footing and remains in a stable growth pattern, and forecasters project that this pattern is going to continue through 2019. Good news. The economic conditions are tracking closely with expectations, and when you see the word collections, that is the revenue collections. They're expected to remain on target throughout this fiscal year. The state's personal income tax rate reduction and the increased standard deduction for 2019 is going to slow that growth in our personal income tax collections, but there's also been the Supreme Court decision that has increased the sales and use tax collections, and if you're not familiar with that, it was really South Dakota versus Wayfair Inc., and it was around granting states greater authority and requiring that retailers collect and submit or remit sales tax. The national and state economy remain in a steady growth pattern, and then there's all the caveats of things that can go wrong, and that they, of course, have to mention. You know, slowing global economy, trade wars, tighter financial conditions, political instability, obviously are all capable of derailing our economic forecast. So in looking at the economic outlook, because now we are looking forward as they begin to plan for their budget for their biennium for the state, and as I said, the Fiscal Research Division and Office of State Budget and Management will put together what they call a consensus or a revenue consensus forecast. The outlook for 1921 biennium. So the forecast now projects that for 1819 revenue collections again to be above the budgeted amount, and by the end of the year at 150.8 million or 0.6 above the budget, and expect stable and modest growth to continue during the upcoming biennium. The general fund revenue is expected to increase to $1.7 billion and reach $25.8 by the end of fiscal 2021. The employment outlook for the state is expected to continue to follow the upward trend, and employment's going to increase at steady gains of 1.2% each year. Obviously, very positive news. I mentioned about sales tax collections increasing, and they're projected at 5.3% and 4.6% respectively in the next 2 years of the biennium. And as I said, that's primarily associated with that Supreme Court decision. And in one of the documents, it mentioned that we are expecting that to be about $125 million in extra revenue just as a result of that decision in sales tax for us. So corporate income tax collections, they're always volatile. You can see that they're projecting they're going to fall in the upcoming year and then grow by 6.3% in the following year. But overall, again, the forecast assumes this consistent, solid economic growth is going to continue through the upcoming biennium. So in general, overall, I would say that the state's forecast presented in both the revenue update and also the forecast, census forecast, is very positive. The early budget driver considerations, I shared this with you at our last meeting. I just wanted to have it for your reference as we go through the conversation about what our true budget landscape for the current year looks like, or for the upcoming year. And even with all that forecast data, I can tell you that it's still impossible for me to predict what the state revenue is going to be for even the state, and much less for CMS or for education in general. So you see there that we know that we have to wait until there's some decisions that are made, until we can get some concrete estimates in order to finalize a budget, but we will be making some estimates, and that's one of the things that we want to talk about, some of the assumptions we'll make. It's too early to predict the county funding, and we know that federal grant allotments aren't typically available, even the estimates, until late spring. So one of the assumptions that we always have to decide is what we're going to use for salaries and benefit increases. And so where we've landed this year is to use some historical averages. This is as good as anything that we can use to predict. So the 3-year average for the certified staff, so that's for your teachers and your instructional support staff, anyone that's paid on the certified teacher salary schedule that I just went over earlier, has been about 5%. So that's the intent at this point, is to use about a 5% increase. The 3-year average for the school-based administrators is about 6%, and for non-certified staff for CMS has been 3%. On the benefit increases, I will tell you these make me even more nervous because there's just a lot of uncertainty. But the 2-year average for health is 5%, and the 2-year average for the retirement rate is 7.5%. So at this point, that's most likely the percentages it will go to. we're still evaluating and barring any additional information that might come, from the state or from legislative folks. So I talked about some of the assumptions that we would make. We will assume that the state's going to provide teacher positions at the prior funding level ratios, so in the same ratios by grade level, and we'll use that in determining how many additional teacher positions we will be allocated for our growth. And we will assume that the state will provide enhancement teachers in accordance with the House Bill 90. Of course, that was the class size reduction. And you know that they were moving into a different grade this year, and that some of the requirements will actually go into place for next year. So we will assume that we will get that second or phase 2 of those teachers. Last year, we got about 90 teachers for House Bill 90. And then under enrollment, we are projecting that we will have an increase of about 250 students next year. And then the charter school enrollment's also likely going to increase because we have 12 existing charters that will be adding a grade level. And we're also adding 2 new charters next year that will open in a K-6 growing to a K-8 over the next few years. We will add new square footage, which will of course increase utility and maintenance costs. And when we add new schools and new square footage, it can also require additional staffing because, custodial staffing, et cetera. So this is the first glimpse of, if we use those assumptions that I just spoke to in terms of percentages and averages of the historical trends in order to estimate what these increases might look like, you can see what some of the cost buckets begin to shape up to be. Under sustaining operations, House Bill 90 supplement that, you may recall if I said we're going to get teachers, then there's also the local supplement component that we need to add to our local budget for those additional teachers, even if they are state funded. We're expecting that there's going to be utility increases, and there's also going to be increases in our school resource officer contracts. In growth and new space, I mentioned we will be adding additional square footage, and so that is still a rough estimate, but we'll continue to work through that. The charter school pass-through, this is also an estimate, and you notice all these say estimates. So give me some grace next week or next month when we come to you with the exact number, because we really are just still trying to dial in on exactly what those enrollment projections for charters would be, and that, of course, will determine what the increase needed would require. And the benefit rate increases, I mentioned we would using the 2-year trend for retirement and health. You can see that will add an additional $3.2 million to our locally funded budget. And then if we just provide those increases based on the averages for the past 3 years for the categories noted there, certified, school admin, and non-certified, that would cost with benefits $13 million. So the landscape for the things that we consider sort of those things we have to start with, that we need to know what that cost would be, if you add all that together, it would come to $26.2 million. And you see that there's no number above the priorities and new investments because those haven't been completely defined or determined yet. And so that would be in addition to that, those costs there. Which takes me to the conversation for tonight, which is we wanted to get some feedback from the board, or at least some conversation going around specific areas, things that we have been talking about and would like to have considered for additional investment. We've broken that into 3 categories and 3 buckets. Our kids need investments in people, our kids need investments in equity, and our kids need investments in support. And so under each of these areas, you will see just ideas, and we've tried to use language that we would have called it before. So for example, under investments in people, we do want there to be adequate and competitive pay for our educators, and then the living wage for folks outside the classroom. So in our terms, that might look like the state-driven salary and benefit increases, another local supplement increase. You may recall we increased the local supplement last year for our certified staff, market-driven adjustments for non-certified staff, or even employee recognition programs, some sort of additional type program. In investments in equity, we've been talking about a guaranteed viable curriculum, significant conversation around that, and focus on consistency across the district in that endeavor. So that might look like new curriculum or textbook adoptions. That would obviously come along with additional professional development required if you do a new curriculum adoption. and then also, for example, fine arts exposure and experiences for our students. And investments in support, I'm sure this is no surprise. We want to continue to increase our counselors, psychologists, and social workers to improve those ratios. We are still nowhere close to the recommended ratios, and so there will definitely be some consideration for that, as well as additional mental health supports and investments in safety and security. So you can see we've listed there reducing those ratios of students to staff in those categories. Schools, safety and security, we're calling this phase 3 at this point. And then preventive maintenance and custodial staffing at schools. There's likely to be some conversation around those needs as they are very significant. And then cultural proficiency is also another category in the area of investments and support. So with that, I'd turn it over to the superintendent to see if he has anything else to add, but really we just wanted to see if you had any initial reactions, if you have something burning on your mind that you don't see that you'd like to lift up. I'd definitely like to hear from you.
Well, I think, board members, certainly we're going to have other opportunities to talk about these things that are priorities for you, because this is not the appropriate forum to have that. We actually thought we would be in a workshop setting in that room this evening. And we laid this out for the Board of County Commissioners the other day, that we really continue to invest in 3 key areas. You certainly have the opportunity to talk to us both individually and collectively over the days ahead, but if there's anything that you'd like to say now that would give Sheila and I a little more power in kind of the conversations that we're having with staff, that would be helpful to us. But at the same time, I know it's a difficult forum for that kind of conversation. With that, the chair will recognize Dr. Jones. She would if she was looking.
She will. Do I have to wait?
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Take the meeting.
And Dr. Jones.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. Thank you for this report. And as slide 12 says, areas being considered for additional investment. And investment is a key word here. And as I'll go back and refer to the comments that Mr. Strain made regarding his reason for not supporting student wellness. I think there's probably, with all 3 of these investments being highly important, in my mind, in everything that I've experienced, the investments in support are critical, because we are teaching the whole child. And for many years now, we've invested singly in academics. We even had that in our mission vision, just the academics. And we see over the years, we continue to get the same thing, the same outputs. We must invest in the whole child, the wellness part of it. Academic, that will lead to academic growth. So yes, it will be expensive, but when we think about, we have to prioritize all of the time, whether it's a home budget or whatever, personal budget, we have to make big decisions. But I would most emphatically come down upon looking at that third investment as being highly, highly essential.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Ms. Sawyer?
Thank you. I'm pleased that we're calling out investments in equity, and I am very excited that we will have a guaranteed viable curriculum very soon, because too long we've had schools that have not had the educational opportunities that the students deserve. I'm hoping that embedded in the budget is the continuation of our weighted student staffing model as a tool for equity, and I know that the ratio, the number that was created, that drove that, was created because that's what we could afford that year. It wasn't based on need. That's how much money we had then. And I would encourage us to go back and look at that and say, can we move that ratio closer to a demonstrated need from a just sort of what we had the year that was created, and it hasn't changed over time significantly. So that's something I would like us to look at.
Okay. Anyone else? Ms. Marshall?
I want to echo Dr. Jones' comments about support. I think that clearly across the county, our commissioners have heard the need for increased numbers of counselors, psychologists, and social workers. Folks in the community talk to me about this often, that is as much a part of safety as physical safety supports that we're putting in our schools. So having the bump in academics as well as increased safety, I think is going to be a real positive for that particular investment. And I think we're well on our way, even with student wellness, on implementing some things, and we're aggressively asking for those from the county and for the state. I also am very interested in living wage. I know the county has done that for some of their employees. I would really love to see what that would look like for us. And we have done that with some groups of our employees, but all our employees are valuable, and we need to be able to speak to that in terms of money as we speak to the important piece that they play on our teams every day. So those are two things I'm interested in.
Okay. Ms. Sanders?
I just wanted to speak on what Dr. Jones said and add my own comment. I think on behalf of me and my classmates that I believe that investments in support is the way to go, and I feel like it's very important, not more important than all the other investments, of course, but I do believe that reducing the ratio from students and for students and counselors will help out in the classroom, because I know teachers are taking on that responsibility of helping with some emotional support and stuff, and we don't actually use the counselors for emotional support. It's more for scheduling classes and stuff like that, so I do believe that that's very important.
Okay. Ms. Dashew?
Well, I'm looking forward to the community forums and hearing from our community what their priorities are, hearing more from students. If you hear more feedback, send it our way, Kendall. And I'll just briefly observe tonight that these investments are clearly aligned with our strategic plan, and glad to see that.
I just wanted to second what Ms. Marshall had said about a living wage. There was a really powerful New York Times Magazine article this week by Matthew Desmond, who wrote a very powerful book called Evicted, that summarizes some of the research that the impact of a living wage has on students and on children and families, so that livable wage for the parents, our CMS parents whose students are in our schools, that kind of the living wage not only helps in the investment in people, but the research truly supports that it supports the social emotional well-being of our children and families, so that having a living wage for all of our employees will have a positive impact on all our families. I mean, we are paying some of our employees below the poverty line, and that is unconscionable.
Ms. Dashew?
Just to clarify, I mean, yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying, that a lot of our employees are also our parents.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? I think my emphasis would definitely be in investment in people. And Mr. Strain, to get to your point, I think that investment in support helps us with Policy JL, student wellness, because it's there. And I also echo Ms. Sawyer, whenever our people are stable, then the kids' lives are stable. So stability is something that a lot of our children do not get to see. And with our homeless numbers going up higher and higher, we've got to get a grip on some stability for our children so that we can create and put them in atmospheres where learning can be done. So I agree with all three of these investments, Mr. Superintendent, but definitely for people and for the support that our students and our children need.
Well, thank you. We'll use that feedback, and we'll come back with another set of discussions before we actually bring a formal recommendation, but thank you.
And if I could, I'll just hit the highlights on the calendar, just to echo what some of you already have highlighted. But we will be having some community engagement sessions over the next 6 weeks or so. Coming up this Thursday night at 6 p.m. We actually put a revision on your calendar. The date has been, the time has moved from 6:30 back to 6 o'clock for the February 28th session. And then on March 7th from 6 to 8. And then on April 11th from 6:30 to 8:30. And I skipped April 3rd from 6:30 to 8:30. So lots of engagement opportunities over the coming weeks for our community and staff and students and anyone who will join us to provide feedback. And we
Ms.
will
Shirley,
be.
can I interrupt and just say the meeting on the 28th from 6 to 8 is at Renaissance West STEAM Academy. The meeting on the 7th is at Quail Hollow Middle School. And the meeting on the 3rd of April is at Mallard Creek. So we're trying to go across the county so that citizens can have impact into our budget discussions.
Absolutely.
Also, then the community
11th.
engagement on the 11th is at Crown
Crown
Point
Point.
Elementary. I'm sorry, Sheila, I didn't mean to
Oh,
interrupt.
that's good, perfect. That's really all. And then we'll be back on the 26th with the superintendent's recommendation. And just as a reminder, we will be asking for your approval on the budget on April 23rd. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. When I was over here with my head put together with the Assistant General Counsel, we were talking about some information that had been given out, and I had mixed her up, and I apologize for that. So we're going to go back to action item A and those two motions because we need to have some clarification around it. Now, do we need to re-vote?
Madam Chair, I heard the vote as 4-3 in favor of the substitute motion. I received a text from a colleague who said that the vote was 3-3 with one abstention.
Right.
If that was indeed the vote, 3-3 with one abstention, then that motion failed, and the original motion needs to be voted on.
Okay.
If it was 4-3, the substitute motion was 4-3, then that motion passes. So it was my misunderstanding.
Okay.
It wasn't a 4-3 vote.
All right, thank you. So what we can do to rectify this is go back and redo the vote. Is that what I hear you saying?
Well, what was the vote?
Well, it was 3-3.
Okay, so yes, 3-3 with one abstention, so the substitute motion did fail.
Okay, so now we go to vote on the main motion.
That's correct.
Okay, all right, and the main motion was to uphold the recommendation submitted by the superintendent, which was to extend the continuous learning calendar for 1 year.
That's correct.
Those in favor of that recommendation, that motion, let it be known by a show of hands.
The superintendent's
Yeah,
recommendation.
I'm changing my vote.
Okay, so that is 2. Against that motion, raise your hand. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the main motion fails. It's 5-2. Okay. So now where are we now? Back to the substitute motion?
So
No.
at this point,
So,
you can
need a
make,
new motion.
well, you
Yeah.
can make a
We-
new
but-
motion. The board, a new motion can be made.
all right. So the main motion has failed.
Main motion failed, and I move that we cancel the CLC effective this year.
You already did that.
Well, if the main motion failed, then it's canceled. Is that correct?
No.
No, okay. So we still have to go to the,
Yep.
okay. All right. Do you have a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor of the motion to cancel CLC for this,
Should we have discussion?
Next.
if there needs to be discussion, it can be, okay?
I
Ms.
just have a question. So, and just to understand, so we're back to voting on canceling it this year without,
Yes.
not extending it 1 year. So for the superintendent, what does this mean? So I've heard one issue with teachers who have not been budgeting for this, who are going to miss a paycheck. What other implications are there to cancel this without a year's notice? Is it as far as administratively for hiring or for, I don't know, just what does this mean for principals?
Well, I think there are a number of issues. One, you have a significant participation rate through the magnet program. Akeisha, I'm looking at you. People who relied on the calendar presumption that it was going to be funded, so they made their decisions for enrollment based on the recommendation going forward. You have a significant number of folks, I think, in the community who voted, who again indicated their preference for the recommendation to continue it so they can make their plans that are now going to be expected. And I would say it's probably several hundred folks, because it's not just teachers, it's support staff members, it's custodians,
Summer
it's
care, child care.
who will have at least one pay period interrupted. Now, one might argue that 3 months is enough time, but I would argue that's probably not the case, because these are our lowest paid employees in many cases. And for them to make up a month's pay in 3 months is probably not something they can do. In fact, I will remind you all as board members that we had one teacher last year who, because of an involuntary transfer process, weighed across each of you, I think, to talk about her difficulty in that process. That said, we will be guided by whatever the board says, and by tomorrow morning we will communicate with people. So again, I'm simply sharing that it is much more complicated than one might think it is this late in the year.
Okay, Ms. Sawyer.
That's not your fault. That's ours as an administrative team.
The reason I didn't support this stopping immediately in the first round, and I will not support it now, is because folks signed up for these schools with an expectation during the choice lottery that that was the calendar they would be on. And to me, that seems incredibly unfair to have entered into a choice lottery, to have signed up for a school and find the calendar shifting. That and the challenge of staff and their pay. I think our staff work extraordinarily hard for low pay, and I think it's not kind of us to pull the rug out from under them at the last minute. While I am not convinced, I don't think there's really evidence of academic gains from the continuous learning calendar. If they are weak. However, I think that it makes sense to have a planned exit from it that allows families and staff adequate time, rather than to just stop it seemingly, after the lottery period is over and after staff, I think, expectations of a continuation have happened, because that's how people signed up for school.
Okay. Ms. Byers-Bailey.
I'd just like to speak to the one part of the conundrum regarding the magnet schools with the continuous learning calendar, because there are two magnet schools that have the continuous learning calendar, and the overwhelming feedback that I got from the communities at those schools were that the continuous learning calendar was a hindrance to more people signing up for those programs than it was an obstacle, rather than a benefit. I've gotten a lot of communication from both communities that when it comes to the magnet, the continuous learning calendar was a hindrance. And we want those magnets to thrive. Now, I'll say, personally, I was and still am in favor of the continuous learning calendar. I've always been in favor of the continuous learning calendar, and I've not changed my mind. I wanted it to continue indefinitely. but I can count votes, and I can understand that that wasn't to be. And if I'm not going to get my wish, then I have to look at what is best for those schools. If we're not going to let it go, and I understand the issue that we had last year with the staff person that got abruptly changed from the continuous learning calendar to the traditional calendar, and it was a hardship, and it's going to be a hardship. But the other thing that influenced my vote for the dropping my dream, which was the continuous learning calendar to be continued indefinitely, was when I asked the question about that $500,000 for compensation for the intercessions. Because I had hoped that if we said, well, then just drop the intercessions, that the $500,000 would go away. It was explained by Dr. Watts, that's not the case. And without saving that, then I don't see the benefit of continuing to spend for a program that we're going to terminate anyway.
The only thing that and I appreciate that, but I do want to call the board's attention to the fact that between the two CLC calendars, 80% of those who responded said that they wanted to continue with an alternative calendar. Only 19% of those who responded said they wanted to return to the traditional calendar this coming year.
I get that.
Now, part of the
80% of how many?
That's what else.
well, but 80% of it's not a huge sample size. The largest sample size was 127 folks who responded at Bruns. Okay. But the point is everybody had the opportunity. Those who took the time to do it, I believe, would think that their wishes would be respected. And it's not to say that they're disrespected. You have more knowledge than I think most people do as board members about the costs and the benefits of things and the outcomes. But I simply don't want the board to make a decision where they don't have all of that information that they're considering, because I think that's partly my role. But I'd also say this to the board. Remember, this probably conversation started in, gosh, Denise, help me. Was it January?
She's gone.
She's
It
gone.
was January.
It was January, and then we heard from people who said, you haven't surveyed all the parents. So then we did survey the parents and got that information. That's partly what delayed this a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay?
And I would just like to respond that those 80% of those parents that wanted the continuous learning calendar, they didn't want it for just one more year. They felt the way I do. They wanted it to continue
Well, and I want to be clear,
indefinitely.
it's not 80% parents, it's
Yeah.
parents, staff,
And-
community members, and others.
Yeah.
It's not just, and it's probably disproportionately staff-heavy in terms of the vote.
That wasn't just for one more year. That wasn't what they were responding to. They
They were
wanted
simply
it.
asking about the calendar without a
Right.
caveat on it.
Yeah.
Mr. Strain?
No, the clarification was made. It wasn't
Okay.
80% of parents that responded that way. It was 80% of respondents, the majority of which were staff.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay. Dr. Jones?
And I think what weighed heavily with me was the child benefits and and we didn't get extensive conversation on it, but the absenteeisms and the real genuine, authentic participation, because just in conversations that appeared to be one of the problems on legitimizing the educational calendar for some children, because the very children we are trying to serve during that time saw their peers out having fun and on a totally different calendar, and so they didn't respect the persons that we had targeted did not respect that time in particular.
It's also an artifact of your choice plan, though, because your choice plan doesn't necessarily require that every sibling go to the same school that their siblings. So it created a bit of a disconnect for some families. I've talked to several families who had children who are on 3 different calendars. But my sense would be that families who choose that.
Okay. Ms. Dashew?
I'll just point out that too, that a lot of the families in the CLC schools have a high mobility rate, and the kids are moving around a lot, bouncing from one family member to another, so they're coming in and out of different calendars, which is another challenge of it.
Okay, any other discussion? Ms. Marshall?
I'm still torn, really. You've seen me now vote to keep one more year to go, and I'm just weighing all this because I don't think that there's a particularly easy answer, and I certainly feel for staff that might be impacted by this. I think that we asked the General Assembly to do this, and they granted it, but we realized that we didn't have enough schools in the same situation, and you're just going to have a larger group for this to really be impactful. So I don't want us to leave the impression that it won't work somewhere, but I think there has to be a critical mass in order for it to work. There's not here, and I feel torn about staff implications, but I don't think that we're getting the bang for our buck on student performance, and that in the end is where I probably will spend most of my vote on that. But I appreciate everybody's perspective on this, because I do think that this is a complicated issue, and there's no really great answer right now.
And we definitely don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that we are not in favor of calendar flexibility.
Absolutely.
We are in favor of calendar flexibility. It's just that, as you said, this was just a small sampling, and probably if we had a larger sampling, as other districts might have, we could see some differences here. Okay.
The whole school.
All right, going to the substitute motion.
It is the main motion now.
No. Oh, it is the main motion now, okay.
It is.
All right, Mr. Strain's motion. All in favor of Mr. Strain's motion that we end the CLC now? If you're in favor of that, please show by a raising of your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Against? That is 2. So that motion carries. Okay. All right. I want to thank everyone for being out here with us tonight, and thank you for sitting in. And before we go, I'm going to turn to Ms. Marshall as chair of the IRC for a clarifying statement also.
Before we end tonight, I would like to take a moment to give some clarification. As chair of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee, I wanted to clear up some misconceptions in the media today regarding a piece of legislation that was filed on behalf of CMS. Last week, members of the Mecklenburg delegation filed House Bill 145, which, if enacted, would allow the current North Carolina Department of Public Instruction school performance grading system to continue under the same 15-point scale that has been in place since its inception. I bring this up tonight because multiple media outlets reported on this legislation today in a fashion that caused misunderstanding all across the state. To clarify, the 10-point scale used to calculate your children's grades remains in place, and this legislation does not, and I repeat, does not impact individual student scores. This legislation simply requests that the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction school performance grades assigned to schools maintain the 15-point scale that has always been in place. Thank you.
Thank you, and I guess the operative word is school performance.
School performance,
grade,
not individuals.
Not individual students. All right, thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor of the motion, let it be known by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Let's go home.
All right.
you.